So ever since I was young, I've had a bit of an issue with the weather.
Sorry.
Um, yeah,
That's me.
no,
I'm trying to get your fucking 3DS and all your games on it.
yeah, legit. But no, the weather and I have been frenemies, I suppose. Living in multiple houses that were destroyed in increasingly elaborate ways by bolts from the blue or storms out of nowhere or things descending from the heavens. Um,
Man, no, you are really from the Midwest.
very true, yeah. Including I stand in my driveway and only go inside no matter how bad the storm is when the sky turns like green and like the
hmm
pressure drops and it's like, okay, time to
hmm
go.
hmm
Um, but yeah, even like weird weather phenomenon like my grandfather, like patrilineal grandfather's home being destroyed by ball lightning not once but twice.
Hey, have you looked into which spirit he pissed off? Once is already a lot for ball lightning. Twice, like
Mhm.
aliens are after him.
Yeah, and in looking into it,
And they were.
and they were indeed um some bogos that needed to get his bogos binted.
Well, and then you were born.
Mhm.
Oh my God. Do you miss it though? The Midwestern spring?
I do, yeah. The living in the mountains is weird now because it's like very local violent storms
Mm,
instead of violent storms the size of like multiple states.
yeah.
So like drive one town over and suddenly it's a sunny day, whereas before it's like town flattened, you know.
Mm.
Which I like. Like the it's just a different quality of the thunder out there too.
Meanwhile, salt is like more rain.
Perpetually and always. Perpetually and always.
Be not alarmed at the frightful howls which you may hear. It's Svinga, Salt, and Ball Lightning chasing his grandfather key. Uh, because it was. I mean, twice is a lot, honestly.
hmm
Yeah,
Yeah, he was
well,
always a strange gentleman with a strange career. We'll leave it at that, lest the feds find me.
yeah, no, no, let's not
Um,
go further. But
but yeah.
mhm. And speaking of the feds, do not check us out at patreon.com/the frightful howls. This is a fed-free zone. Because we have a bonus episode every month curated by and for our patrons. We have a Discord server. We have Salt's Fantastic Almanac, a monthly live occult book club where we discuss a text of your choosing. This month we're doing Ida Craddock, our homegirl,
Mhm.
spirit love, spirit sex, all sorts of fun things. We have show notes for every episode and a whole tier for a monthly group spell work from the three of us on your behalf. This month it's all about persuasion
Mhm.
and eloquence.
The gift of gab, if you will.
Yeah. Also, remember to give us a like, rating, and review on Spotify, iTunes, or wherever you may be listening to us. It helps us fight the demiurge, the algorithm, and the feds. And check if you need help from being chased by ball lightning, check out our services because Key offers personalized coaching in magic and mediumship, sorcery for hire, readings, custom talismans, oils, and tools. I offer bulk and five-mancer readings. My books are open as of June 1st. And Salt's books are closed, but keep an eye out for his monthly astrological almanac on the Patreon. And lastly, hit us up on social media. I'm at Dragon Cunning. Salt is at SaltCNC, and Key is at barnowl.key. A very alien coded animal, might I note.
Very true. Very true. The psychic screen memories with the homies who go silently in the night.
Indeed.
Gliding like UFOs.
hmm
Hmm.
Well, why are we talking about weather and why are we talking about the warmer seasons today?
So it's a bit of a protest to the heavens, actually, because at least down here we've had one of the driest springs I've ever experienced, and really, like, what that is it's a reminder that we need to be doing more weather magic. Unless your name is Finger, where just breathing seems to be enough for that.
It is a carefully honed skill. Pacts aside, it is something I love practicing and something I encourage people to practice. But yes, thank you.
But you see, the thing is, the listeners may not know that the reason that breathing is because of how much work went in, right?
Oh, yeah, thank you,
Hmm.
thank you. See, I like to mention all those like stories you told me of like Taoist weather magic with like the cultivation. That I was on a parallel journey. It was just accomplished through different means.
No, that's impressive. I love it. Um, so the other reason, on top of the unfortunate condition of the skies over here, is I wanted to talk about the seasons turning of the year, like calendars and feast origin. And I realized that, okay, well, if we're doing that, we need to talk about weather as well. So we'll cover a bit of both. And we will definitely be doing an independent episode on weather magic as well down the line, right? Like we can't not. I
Yeah, we
think
have
that's something
to.
we've had in the cards for a long time.
hmm
And the consequence of adding like, weather elements in as well is that we're probably not going to have time for like autumn and winter in this episode, but again, that just leaves us more room for later on. Um, and this episode really was actually inspired by a really interesting question in a Q&A about heliacal risings, and I really love that question. It made me want to kind of discuss the topic of calendars, of seasons, how time itself impacts our practices and our relationship with spirits, people, the land around us. And that's probably a bit too much for a Q&A answer, right? Where obviously you want to focus on the question itself. So I figured why not make it, more or less its own episode on the tangential topics that I'd like to touch on, that all of us want to touch on and like have stuff to share.
hmm
Because, everyone has to engage with the seasons, right? Like turning of the year cycles of time. It's sacred. It's one of those things that saturates the lives, not just of us, like practitioners, but just average people, right? Like anyone from a, not anyone, but like the majority of people from a European background, North American background celebrate Christmas. Um, every people culture has their own regional festivities, but you also have those universal ones like solstices and equinox, where the astronomical nature make them nearly omnipresent across the globe. And those changes in the world, like the changes wrought by time, they can really impact our relationship with the spirits, both locally, our own, like, when we get into changes in climate and temperature amongst the various kingdoms of animals and vegetables, how do water spirits change when the river they live in freezes over, right?
hmm Yeah, or like what is it about cultures that say that don't have seasons necessarily the same way? They only uh there's not necessarily the same emphasis on planets then. There's more of an emphasis on some constellations for sure, but not necessarily like planetary magic per se.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, or even like northern and southern hemisphere, right? When you start flipping
hmm
around the seasons, the impact of that, it makes sense why. But obviously, like I think we do tend to think, and that includes myself, we do tend to think in terms of like a very temperate climate, like a northern latitude climate, right? Um, which is quite fascinating, especially when we consider that a lot of the sources we're drawing on may not be drawing on such an explicit definition, especially, when you start considering the interrelation of like South Asian texts, and like the Arabic world, right? Where these texts are, yeah, I just find it, that's not to suggest Arabic astrologers weren't using four seasons, obviously they were, but, you know, um,
Yeah, and I just think it's important to note that we have to start where we are, but it's not truly universal in that sense. And really, when it comes to seasons, especially with people, especially with climates that don't have them or ones that are more closer to the equator or different or in different biomes where the weather phenomena is completely different. Like these there's going to be festivals and deities and spirits that are going to be associated with that phenomena instead. And really, when it comes to like dividing the night sky into different parts, that those particular constellations are going to have carry the meaning of those seasons as well. So like it's interesting because like Key and I are in Kibanda, and Brazil obviously has is south of the equator, so there's a completely
Hmm.
flipped schedule of seasons. So when we celebrate certain things, it's actually the complete opposite there. And that brings about some interesting mysteries, but obviously what it is to practice a tradition on your own soil, but also what it is to have it actually be completely opposing the original birthplace of that tradition.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean there's in the like purely astrological context as well, you see it like there's so many arguments about do you flip the zodiac when you're on the south of the equator and stuff like that.
Mm.
Like and it's fascinating. Like it's definitely an area where there's just so much to cover. Um like I think just what an impact they have, right? Like even when you're devoid of seasons, like we talk about the equinoxes, fundamentally they're also about light, right? Like it's not just the temperament and like the temperature itself changing. It's also the amount of light a certain place receives or encounters and experiences, and that can get more and more extreme, especially when you move further up or down the poles and so on. But I think it's really hard to overstate just how impactful these natural cycles can be in a magical sense, right? Like even when we're talking about herbalism and plants and stuff like that, like for most regions of the world, spring is generally going to be the optimal time for planting and growing, right? And that's a similar reason as well why we look to the moon to be young when we're planting things as well. The new moon and shortly after is kind of like the early spring phase. 'Cause planets have their own seasons, through phases and stuff. But I mean, even things like fishing, right? Like key, you can confirm that there's stuff to heat the water for winter fishing, get those fish a bit more
Hmm.
proactive and lively. Times of year when it's just optimal to look for certain kinds of fish, like hunting as well, deer stalking and all that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, minute seasonal changes and patterns creating even, brief windows where you can actually fish for certain things or, go after certain areas or stuff like that. If it's a mild winter, then, you might be looking to move up a bass fishing window into, the early spring around like kind of pre-spawn feeding areas and stuff like that. But yeah, it's all to say like even, a couple degree change in either direction will completely throw that window from, mid-March to mid-May to late May.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean
So,
it's huge.
and I think even, getting ahead of myself, but like dealing with weather oracles, like predicting based on, hey, what's the weather like this week of the year to go like months and months out, things like that. Um,
Yeah, I mean, like nature's always one of the best markers, right? Like what you said actually makes me think of like migratory birds, right? And like knowing the
mhm,
seasons where they're moving around and watching when they set off early, like what are the indications of that? What are the implications of that? Like there's so much that can be done through that. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, honestly, because it's yeah.
mhm. Yeah, I was also just kind of thinking like, going back to our episode with Albert Bjorn, animist immersion, it's in the Icelandic context, you only have a minimal window to go out and gather herbs for an entire year or to gather, crops for an entire year. So check out that episode as well, listeners, because it was cool and really, really made us think about how that changes things around.
Genuinely, yeah. I think as well, one of the other things that can kind of reveal just how much impact time as well can have on like our spiritual lives and our practices, like the taboos around certain feast days, right? Like, it's finger, you can talk about this one for days on end,
Yeah.
much to all of our benefit.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I that's the thing too is so there's a joke often with like Serbian Orthodox traditions that like most feast days are more about what you shouldn't do. Like you'll see if you like Google like any feast and it's like I don't know, for example, like Danas je Petkindan, like today is Petka's day, you'll just see like taboos. Like women shouldn't weave, they shouldn't do housework, they shouldn't do anything like domestic and so on and so forth. Really, in my ancestral village, or at least one of the ancestral villages of my family, my father at once got really upset with a bunch of the people there because they were trying to organize the construction of something, and every single day basically was some feast that someone could say, "Oh, I can't do anything because we're not supposed to work on this day." And he was like, "This is just an excuse to be lazy. Like, shut up and like help me." But there are taboos, obviously, for different feasts, and there's certainly taboos involving like the particular notion of like weather magic. So, for example, like during the dog days of summer or during the time period as well, especially this is in the summer periods after Elijah's Day, Ilian and going um, further is really when the sun starts to kind of calm down. It's when the peak of the heat fades. There's a saying in our language, which is like from Saint Elijah's Day, the sun grows ever milder or becomes like milder or sweeter, which is really just to say that from then on, the heat is not as bad. But in July, especially because Ogen Maria in the Fiery Mary is at the late July period, and you have Martha and so on and so forth. Like these are the days that are the heat is the strongest, and really that's when certain spirits, like the Poludnitsa, for example, Lady Midday, the Noon Wraith, if you've played The Witcher 3, is roaming the fields, and that's when heat stroke can happen, right? So you're not taboos there are never to go out at noon at the peak of the sun, which is also a very practical thing not to do because you can actually get a heat stroke if you're working the fields, harvesting grain, for example, around that time. But there's also all kinds of interesting like taboos and things, you know, each one could be its own episode regarding different saint feasts. And really, ultimately, what it's trying to do is noticing how spirits that in the springtime start to wake up, especially during the Lent period, serpents in the ground that were dormant, and literal actual serpents as well, that started to come up from the ground, especially on Theodor Saturday, which is the first Saturday of Great Lent, associated with Theodor Tyron, the saint, and also Veliki Todor, one of the leader of the Todorci spirits, who is this kind of centaur-like, except instead of like a man's head or torso and then a horse's body, it's a horse with a rider whose body is fused with the horse. So there's no legs. It's just like a body coming out the middle. And these spirits ride out and punish people who have broken oaths or fractured or particular bonds or have not paid back debts. And it's like your last chance to do that while Lent is about to fully kick off. And so when these spirits come out and start getting renegotiated, the kind of rays of summer begin to kind of heat up the ground. And also furthermore, like spring begins to really churn. You obviously have Slavic kind of myths of Marjana dying or Marana, and instead the spring period giving way to the summer period where the goddess Lada reigns. You might have the myths of Yarilo and so on. But more than that, really what we're looking at is having a level of concern for, on the one hand, like the fertility of the fields is coming back, so you can do a lot of harvest magic to like protect your skin, protect your hair, protect your youth, protect your beauty. And you can also do a lot of magic specifically to grow your assets. So this is a time of growth and cultivation, especially in that part of the Northern Hemisphere.
Yeah, just especially just mapping like those clusters of saint days out of the seasonal thing, like even finding it throughout really throughout the world, but like especially throughout Europe, like it just is making me think of like the ice mana or Eisenmana, like I guess the ice Heilige
Mm,
in like northern Italy, Switzerland, Germany, Austria, stuff like that, where it's like that third week of May, like 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15 just happen to be really good days for like weather oracle because you can get a good vibe of like what is going on for really the rest of the year just by paying attention. So like Mamertus, Pancras, Servatius, Boniface, and Sophia. Yeah.
Hmm.
Like all in a row there, and then each of them having a particular rulership over an area, a part of the year, a season, the weather itself, just because it's like your day happens to be good to do a weather work.
Hmm.
I think it really demonstrates like, and this is something I think we're all familiar with. Like everyone kind of knows this, but like it's a good demonstration of it anyway. Like in principle, is like the way that spirits are connected with, for lack of a better word, like the cosmos at large, right? Like the way in which the cycles of it sounds a this is the astrologer in me, right? Some people might think this sounds a little bit woo, but like they're connected to the cycles of the cosmos and the changes and transformations that are occurring within it, and they have their responsibilities and their charges over that as well, right? And the way that certain activities become patroned by them when they occur during those times, or they become taboo, like forbidden in the eyes of those spirits, or even offensive to them, depending on like what kind of spirit we're talking about, right? Or like there's the quote from not the quote the that from the Arthurian mythos. One of the characters from like the Arthurian mythos I really like is Gawain, who you know gets stronger with the sun, right? And then when the sun sets, gradually his strength wanes. And I don't
Mm.
know, I find that like I love that.
Yeah. But I do want you to pop off about astrology though. I'm not even gonna lie. Especially if we're gonna look at like cycles and seasons for today or during the warmer months, at least in the Northern Hemisphere. How do you see what the relationship between that is with your astrological practice?
Oh yeah, I mean it's fundamental. It is in like you got to keep in mind, right? I know a lot of the Stoic and also like, earlier like the text from the Chepso and Cyrus, for example, they weren't so Aristotelian in outlook, but in my personal astrology, I do tend towards the Aristotelian perspective. I'm a big Ptolemy stan. Ever since I read the Almagest specifically, I'm like, this man is an absolute monstrosity of a mind.
You're
Um,
also you're also the strongest Aquinas enjoyer that is not Catholic that I think I
yes.
ever met.
Yes, I
Mm.
listen. It's just it's not even necessarily the summer. I'll be honest. It's like the whole story of him being called the was it an ox? Like I just love how I vibe with that.
Yeah, and also Albertus Magnus was a slave.
Yes, yes, exactly,
Hmm.
exactly. Um, so when it comes to astrology, since you mentioned Magnus as well, um, I think when we think about astrology, especially, and again, like through the Aristotelian lens, more or less, but in general as well, like you can't escape its connection with cycles and time because astrology is fundamentally built on those things. Time itself is a celestial construct, right? Like it is something that originates from the stars and their motions. Like the very concept of time we have, our experience of it is all shaded through the motion of the heavens. And obviously, at a deeper level, there's a whole bunch of physics, and I'm not a guy who's very familiar with physics. That's more, I would trust key on that over myself any day of the week. But yeah, so there's that obvious, like, very baseline connection. Um, Now, when we come into how it impacts things in practice, I tend to think first and foremost about like the changes in a given locale based on those celestial motions. So like for example, we mentioned light earlier, right? Like daylight becomes shorter, it becomes longer, and in astrological terms, that has very practical implications. The most important of which obviously being the ingresses and solstices and the turning points when we generate charts for these, but also even something like the sect of the chart. Um, it's not a coincidence, right, that the majority of later astrologers kind of relate sect to the notion of temperament. And in winter, obviously the nocturnal sect is going to be more predominant, right? And in summer, it's going to be the contrary to that. And that's specifically, I think that's one of the things I really like about the doctrine of sect, and why I do think it very much like it shouldn't be neglected, even when we take it to later, like early modern or late Middle Ages sources,
Hmm.
where it may be less often referenced, but it very much fits into those models, which often are themselves also Aristotelian in nature, which do have a very strong emphasis on that temperament, because as the days change, as the seasons turn, it does get hotter and colder, and this does impact the way that the planets behave. And we mentioned earlier on like the unique qualities and like seasons for the planets themselves. Mercury and Venus follow the sun. The inferiors have their own like solar phases, or the three superiors are moving in their own circles. Saturn every 30 years, just under, returning to his origin. Jupiter every 12, Mars every 2. Another sun completes a full circle in a year. It's another wonderland that we find things like the 60-year sexagenary cycle within Chinese calendars, or the conjunctions of Saturn and Jupiter within medieval Arabic sources and mundane astrology. And obviously, like the most important of these is the Aries ingress within the astrological context.
Hmm.
And I do want to dive into that definitely. But before that, before I get into the full rants, I wanna ask you guys how you run your weather magic, because if we're talking seasons and cycles and time, then weather obviously has to be a massive part of that. Even if you're in an area where it doesn't change too much, in some ways that makes it even more important because the changes are going to tend to be more extreme, right? So, what are what are some of your ways of approaching weather magic? What are your mindsets behind it?
For me, because I've been trained very heavily, from my weather magic from the part of Serbia that I'm from, one of the first things we consider is understanding that weather is not something that you manipulate flippantly. When I say it's good to practice, I mean it's a very obvious way to tell if your magic is working, because if you're doing a rain working and it doesn't rain, you know it didn't work. And so, or if it's like you're halting the hail has to halt. It has to actually stop. So I think that because it is something that's so obvious if it's working or not, it's not subtle, you have to be especially careful with it in the sense that it's easy to practice weather magic if there's a community you're doing it for. Like there's a reason to change the weather, there's a reason to manipulate it. But at the same time, you are entering into an existing ecosystem of spirits for whom weather is their language. It's their culture. It's the way that they debate. It's the way that they argue with each other. Like sometimes we think of thunderstorms as arguments between spirits or clashes or fights. And so if you want to break up the fight or halt it, you have to give them a good reason to, and you have to have a certain kind of authority. There are this is class of spirits called Veterani Voivode, which kind of means like wind dukes, that we understand as coming from different directions. So there's like a southwestern wind versus a northeastern wind, for example, and they have their own domains in every place. They're not the same in every location, and they're very local. And so it's kind of, if you think about it, a spirit world map version of wind currents. And so they flow differently throughout different landscapes and so on. But the idea being that it's not just about tracking the weather and being aware of their currents, it's also knowing how to actually insert yourself into this ecosystem. Because if you just work with it flippantly, it can essentially disrupt the environment. It's kind of like introducing too many predator or prey animals into an environment, and then the whole balance gets thrown off. So when I say not engaging with it flippantly, I mean you can have certain spirits be quite upset with you and not heed your call. So, as with any kind of magic, you can clearly do weather magic at the very least through calling on spirits that govern it and persuading them to do their work. If you have a pact with them, or if you have if there's a reason for them to listen to you in the first place. But there's also ways for you to do this yourself. And I would say besides the old classic of beating a rock with a wet rag for rain, um, I think that, which, I know all three of us have done it many different times, there's really a matter of understanding what the different weather phenomena are in your mythology. So, for example, if a thunderstorm is a temper tantrum or a kind of or if a different kind of thunderstorm, for example, is a fight between spirits, how do you know which one is which? The temper tantrum can be soothed, and I'm using the term loosely to just mean like it's upset spirits. It's like a upset difficulty it's the emotions of the sky. In that case, you can soothe it. So you might fly out of your body and soothe it, and like literally like a baby. You hush it, you tell it to be quiet, you tell it to calm down, you tell it it's okay, you tell it things will be better, and you know which herbs to burn and what. We talked about this with the episode with Caspar recently on kitchen magic, as I mentioned quite a lot about the use of kitchen implements in weather magic, such as ladles to stir to clouds or frying pans to trap and fry spirits and so on. On the other hand, if the storm is two spirits fighting or multiple factions of spirits fighting, and you can't necessarily tell them to stop, you might have to join on the side of one of them to vanquish the others. So a lot of the reason why Stuhachi and Vetrovnici and Oblochari and so on, these kinds of weather sorcerers, are considered to be shamans that fight and engage in violent combat with storms is because they pick one side. So they'll fight on the side of the Zmayevi, for example, the stellar dragons against the Eshdaia, the Lamia, the Ala, and so on. These negative dragons or serpents of ill weather that you essentially subjugate. And because the faster the fight is, won, the quicker it is that the storm will fade. And this is really a matter of not just intense training and lots of proving your skills. This is also a matter of knowing which spirits you can call on. So, without going too much into trade secrets, as it were, it really is a matter of like which spirits live in your body and exist with you, which ones leave with you to fight, what are your tools, how do you know how to do these things? Like, do you have your fatwood staff that's burnt on both ends that becomes a spear when you're out of your body? Can you make it back to your body and make sure that you're safe when you've gone fighting? And if it's not a message of combating, can you just tell the storm basically the equivalent of, I know you have to urinate, but I need you to hold it in for 50 minutes. And once I'm home and whatever I'm, transporting that's fragile, can't be rained on is secure, I'm gonna unweave you. So that's through knot magic, for example, knotting the winds, knotting the rain. I do it by braiding my hair or putting up in a really tight bun, where I'll tie my hair with the wind or the rain in it, and as soon as I get to my porch, I untie it, and the rain starts falling again.
A
Bottom ticks.
move that has saved us walking around many times.
Real, real.
Thank you, boys. I listen. I love it, and it also is because I know what I'm. It comes with breath magic, for example, like when I inhale versus exhale, it's whistling while I'm. I always wear a hagstone 24/7, as you guys know. I take it off my neck and I start like spinning it like a bull roar, or else
Mhm.
it's spinning like a pendulum, different motions. If I have a copper bowl, for example, that has caught some rainwater, I can start stirring it using the pendulum of the hagstone. I can have the wind pass through the stone, especially one hole is ideal for this actually, whereas we wouldn't use two holes necessarily the same way. But we would see, out through one and into the other. I take the wind, then, you pass. And so you can redirect storms or weather phenomena in different directions by one, petitioning the spirits of those particular directions, summoning those guardians and telling them to create a blockade, or using the hagstone to say, like, you pass to this end and then you whip it in the other end. So, like, there's a lot of bull roar type stuff that I do. It doesn't actually make a sound because it's just a hagstone, but like I swing it the equivalent of a bull roar into over my head until I feel it,
Mhm.
and I'm whistling the whole time, like whistling, and I'm waiting until my whistle has caught the right spirits, and then I flick it in the other direction, and then I watch the clouds part. When you and I were in Cyprus, do you remember when the storm was coming and the person was like, "Oh, you have to like it's a long ride back to Lefkosia, like but like, maybe you should just stay in the village for like a few more hours because the taxi
Mhm.
guy was having too much fun drinking coffee and hanging out with his friends and he wasn't going to take us. It's just there's only one taxi uh driver in the entire village." And I was like, well, we should walk. And they were like, no, don't walk. It's gonna rain. And there was like a huge storm coming. That's really what I was doing. That's why I was
Mhm.
whistling. Was I was trying to get it to move elsewhere. So like, we have pictures of this too, because the storm started to move completely away from Key and I, and where did the next town over that had a bus stop that we were walking to. It was about like a 35-minute walk.
Mhm.
And the storm was going away from both the village where we came from and away from the town we were going to.
Mhm. It was a very
But
clutch move.
but also like am unfamiliar with the spirits of Cyprus, and so this was also because I made offerings beforehand of water. I have spirits around me that I can have negotiate with the spirits of the weather there, and so on and so forth. And being an island was very special because I could feel that like every single weather spirit being has to pay some homage to Aphrodite.
Mhm.
And because you and I had already had that experience with her, I felt like I had a slightly more easier way to kind of deal with the weather phenomena there.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. It kind of maps onto that structure you were describing, where it's like, okay, who's in charge? Um,
Hmm.
and on that island, it happens to be her.
Yeah, yeah. And really with weather magic, It's knowing your place
Hmm.
because the weather, I mean, Salt, I'm sure you can speak to this better than anyone, but it's heaven,
Yeah.
right? It quite literally is like the realm of the gods. It's the realm of where the highest celestial beings becomes at least somewhat tangentially manifested on this planet. And so you can't just go around there and start messing. Like there are techniques I know that like shoot certain things out of your fingertips or out of hagstones or out of like whistles into the sky and create like a ray that disperses things. But at the same time, like what are you calling on? Like, oh, it's the Lance of St. George. And what is the Lance of St. George? It's the first ray of sunlight that kisses the earth on St. George's Day because that's the official start of summer season, even though technically it's not yet actually the summer solstice. But in the folk calendar, Georgetown, St. George's Day is the official start of the mythological summer season. And
Mhm.
so you can start doing that kind of work after St. George's Day because you're borrowing St. George's power, which is also connected to the god Yarilo, for example. But at the same time, like when it comes to the kind of very intimate play between your power, your spirit's power, and the authority you and your spirits have to negotiate with the spirits that actually rule the weather, it's an intimate balance that involves a lot of offerings and upkeep on every day of the year so that the one time that you really need to use weather magic to create like a very specific effect that changes things considerably, you basically have the necessary resources and clout, frankly, to be able to do it because you've been so humble and pious the whole year.
Yeah, I think I've you're so right because I mean even thinking about English sources, for example, like the vast majority of cases where there is direct weather manipulation is quite often ascribed to diabolical agents, right? Like actively subverting the heavens. Like it's not a necessarily thing you want to be like, from the mind of like a early modern Christian, right? It's not something like you're going, oh, that's excellent. Obviously, it's really, really cool, and that's not going to reflect on modern attitude. But just to
Hmm.
make light of it a little bit there, which I probably shouldn't do because it is like you're saying, like it's a really serious matter. But like, I do think the involvement of diabolic forces so much, like whenever we see this talked about in early modern sources, is really something to chew on and think over, right? Like even when we're talking to Kia Solomon, for example, my understanding is the spirit, like the names on those are not angelical, right? That specific rain-making pentacle. They're terrestrial daemons and aerial spirits, and so moving the weather itself is something that's can change. I mean, even in the context of like Dongbai Xianja, um, when one of the stories is like Lao Hu Santaya, he a certain fox kills a human being. And the Jade Emperor is very unhappy about this. And one of the conditions that he agrees with old Grandmaster Hu III is that we won't. This is like apocryphal, right? That this is folklore, so not everywhere's gonna have this same kind of like understanding or rules. But I have seen it in quite a few places, and it's they're not the immortal family isn't necessarily allowed to manipulate the weather or compel the weather. That's one of the conditions that are laid down on them, because that's the kind that's the domain of other spirits, other very terrifying spirits. Like you don't mess with the thunder department, but.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I really appreciate your emphasis on just how much gravity this kind of stuff actually has because I think it's easy to get carried away with all these like it's really cool tech and on a practical level it is something that is very rewarding, especially if you're like myself and you really like it when it's rainy. It's tempting, right? Like it's worse than I'll be honest. Like it's worse than being on a really strict diet and seeing something really tasty in front of you. No, no, no. If you have the opportunity and the capacity to make it be cold and like have a nice chill rain, like that's just dangerous. That because the consequences of that are very severe if you mess
You're
around.
you're so English.
The the thing is though, is that sometimes it might change by accident. Maybe you drop Psalm 77:17 to Psalm 77:18, just saying it aloud casually, and then it accidentally starts to rain. Like at that point, it's kind of not your fault, right? right? Like you're not going to get in punishment for that. I just need to check in with the expert here.
You're just doing your psalm work. That's all it is.
It's just being a pious Christian, right? Like practicing my
Mm.
psalms.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Yeah. I think too, one thing about it all is that while weather magic is an important style of magic or genre of magic rather, because this is a thing that, literally people depend on. And I think that it's not just in the sense of the agricultural seasons, right? That's why these practices are so important, is because people live and die by them. Their wealth rises and falls with this kind of work. It's why weather magic is so important with treasure hunting magic, or why it comes into contact with magic for wealth, is because if your animals die, or if there's a drought, like your wealth is gone. But similarly, it's an excellent way to destroy enemies. It's an excellent way to bring misfortune upon others. I think just it's not a coincidence that the seventh pentacle of Mars, right, is one that causes hail and tempest. Why is it in the day and hour of Mars? It's a kind of martial magic, right? And like I said, like a lot of this weather magic has to do with combat. It's brutal, and the shaman that goes out and does it every night can die. There's always a risk of death or if at failures. So that's one of the reasons why people who are taught these arcanas have to go undergo frankly, fairly intense training just to make sure that they have the right spirits at their back to be able to do this. On the other hand, Saul, when you made me sound so intense. When you encouraged me to educate myself on the remains of the Three Kingdoms, I couldn't help but like fangirl over Zhuge Liang being able to use literal weather magic to help the Sun family.
Yes, the Battle of Red Cliffs was very pivotal moment. And the fictional depiction of it is equally entertaining.
Yeah, absolutely. It was great. And honestly, that's one of those things too. It's like, what better magic to do for an army, right, than to destroy the opposing army if you're at war using weather sorcery, like cause a ton of mud to happen so their horses and cavalry units get completely overtaken or make them unable to advance on you because of the winds.
Oh yeah, I mean even John D. Wright and the Spanish Armada, like founded or not, like there's a reason there were rumors around him and having, accrediting the sinking of the Armada to John D. I don't know when that started happening, whether or not that actually happened in the period itself or if it was a later revision, but either way it demonstrates that relationship, right? Like the military utility of looking at the weather. And I mean, Theophilus is an early Syriac Christian astrologer in the Abbasid court. He wrote a treatise on mundane and military astrology, and a lot of that work is concerned, not a lot of it, but a decent portion of it is concerned with the weather and like analyzing the weather. It's actually the main method I use if I want to make a judgment on the weather, astrologically speaking, amongst a couple other sources. But it's, his work was literally being used to begin campaigns for the caliphate, or at least advise them on when to begin their campaigns. And yeah, I think that's a really key point you're bringing up there is like the relationship of whether to, not just military affairs, but geopolitics in general, like the entire prosperity and economy of a region, the survival of communities. It's such a huge feature, and its implications can't be overstated. Saying that again, but I mean it.
Could I, speaking of magicians doing weather magic to be petty, can I just mention that one of my favorite, like more recent magical stories of weather magic was when Jack Parsons was beefing with L. Ron Hubbard. Do you guys know that story?
I do
Mhm.
not.
Yeah,
Oh, wait,
yeah.
wait, wait. Okay, so the gist of what was going on was, Jack Parsons and Ellen Hubbard had like a frenemy relationship, and there was all kinds of fuckery going on. I encourage people to research it. There's sex, there's drugs, there's rock and roll, there's also craziness. But at one point, there was a business partnership between them, and Parsons invested some money, and Hubbard invested some money. And it basically, Hubbard used the money to buy a yacht, while Parsons was broke as hell. Like he basically put all his money in this investment, and he was living completely like with nothing. And so, Aleister Crowley was actually suspicious that Hubbard was fooling Parsons, like he was basically pulling a fast one on him by being like, "Hey, let's invest in this scheme together," and then taking all the money and getting himself fancy things. And anyone who knows anything about Scientology knows that like Hubbard is like obsessed with yachts and like Sea Org, and like Navy bullshit, whatever. Anyway, so eventually. Parsons was Jack Parsons essentially discovered this whole ruse and was quite unhappy about it. So he wrote to Crowley saying that he used weather magic, and again, using a martial spirit. This is the invocation of Bartzabel, which is the intelligence of Mars in Agrippa, right? And the quote goes, Hubbard attempted to escape me by sailing at 5 p.m. and performed a full invocation of Bartzabel within the circle at 8 p.m., in brackets a curse. At the same time, however, his ship was struck by a sudden squall off the coast, which ripped off his sails and forced him back to the port where I took the boat in custody. So he basically stood at the pier waiting for him to come back and be like, "No, no, no, you don't get to take this fucking boat. That's my money, you stupid son of a bitch." And he like did the invocation of Bartzabel, had the weather do its thing, waited there for Hubbard to come crawling back because he had to dock because of the weather.
That's doing God's work right there.
It's doing someone's work. It's at the very least doing the Archangel Kamail's work.
Genuinely, yeah, genuinely.
So this kind of
So,
beefing is very modern, and also like lots of people get their start in weather magic because they need to. Like they're traveling. I know many magicians who've told me that like they got their start in weather magic because they were traveling in doing a circuit. They were actively working conferences, or they were traveling with a band or a group, and they were like, we're on a tour bus, so we can't have this be bad. So they were doing a lot of weather magic for those reasons.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, even today, the professional context is still important, right? Like outside of rural communities, even in like the urban environment, it's still something that can have substantial impact, especially on professions that are outdoors or dependent on good weather. The
I mean, think about even the fact that in our very first episode on Toad Magic, when we're talking about like the mummers and the plowmen and so on, so much of that stuff was also weather magic. And the Toadmen, I mean, lots of Toad magic has to do with weather.
yeah, absolutely. Love me a good toad for weather. If not using their bones and shepherding around some clouds, the little crooks. Um, Even just going outside if you find a toad, pour some water on them. It'll rain.
Hmm
Yeah. To
battle
the earlier,
toads.
mhm. Even to the earlier point though, like my weather magic, nice and straightforward. Just pour water on the thing and it will rain.
hmm
Um, Never was too fancy with that type of stuff because it was always just, do you want it to not rain? Put the axe in the stump outside in the direction of the cloud, you know, or you want it to rain, I don't know, throw some rice in the air, throw some grain, and it'll say when it hits the ground, it'll start raining, you know?
I feel
And
like 9 out of 10 weather magic things that you've talked to me about involve putting axes and stumps.
yeah,
Which is
true.
also a very well-known technique, right? Is stabbing.
Mhm.
Is so martial, right? It's stabbing the clouds, stabbing the ground to like earth, as it were, the clouds and the storm to prevent rain, cutting
Mhm.
Drumming
across. I
as
mean, there's
well.
even yeah, and so much of the weather magic in the books of Cyprian, in like Spanish and Portuguese Ciprianos are involved this exactly.
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. Same with just like that very martial nature. Like in truth, I love fighting. Um,
Yeah.
so it's that very much leave the body and start a riot to get it to really rain
Mm, yeah.
or that type of stuff. It's not as elegant or as sustainable an approach, but
Yeah,
I,
totally.
I'm that martial. It's worked out so far.
Yeah, you're a Mars and Scorpio. I mean, but also, like I would say though, speaking of Cyprianios, it may not be Vulcan, and so it's not one that I use a lot for weather magic specifically. But one of my favorite prayers for weather magic is actually the Oración contra rayos, piedras, corazón y tempestad from from El Libro de San Cipriano y Santa Justina, specifically the Cruz
Hmm.
de Caravaca version. Such a good one in general for playing around with that.
Love me some good prayers against lightning.
Hmm.
It's
Mhm.
like also a lot of the, horrible pun intended, but a lot of my weather stuff is tied up in the fishing and sailing things going on.
Hmm.
Where I'm like, so in the same way as like, prayers to saints and those with kind of the mandate to just be able to turn the weather around,
Hmm.
good old Brendan, Saint Nick. Yeah, or against the bolts, Saint Elmo.
Hmm. Hmm.
Mhm. Honestly, I think my favorite part of the Book of Common Prayer, obviously, Britain's always been a maritime nation, and our Christianity kind of reflects that because even in the Book of Common Prayer, like there's prayers for sailors at sea, and things like that. Like, and I think that's probably actually my favorite prayer in the entire thing. It's just, yeah, it's
Mhm.
it's intrinsic everywhere. Even if you're not practicing in a magical sense, like people always want protection and apotropaic rituals within, the context of religious orthodoxy, to protect themselves against, well, heaven sometimes.
No kidding. So much of sailing magic is tied up into weather magic for the very obvious reasons, and so many sailing saints are used to tie up the weather.
Mhm.
Mm.
Shout out to Saint Nicholas.
Mhm.
Shout out to Saint Stephen, the first martyr.
Yeah, true. Very, very true.
Stefan Vetrovity is one of the titles we give him, Stephen the Windy, and he's syncretized with Stribog, who is a god of wind.
Mhm. Hell yeah. One of my faves.
Hmm.
Ooh, love me a guy holding a monastery. Real icon heads in the chat know what I'm talking
Yeah, yeah,
about.
yeah. You take a man to a few Orthodox countries and he comes back with many 2D images.
Very true. Very, very true. Oh man. But, yeah, there's just a lot of stuff like knotting up storms, like tying them, binding them, like even that being intimately involved in the way that like sails are set. Um, and like what are the ones that I use to do wind? It's like, well, it's the one that holds the sail faster.
Hmm.
Um, things like that. So it's just to say there's a lot of interplay. Um,
No kidding.
Yeah, and talking of the weather as well, I think, when it comes to like the way it interfaces with the seasons, right, it's always worth thinking about. And I am unfortunately going to be kind of mostly focusing on like, northern temperate climate, because that's what I'm obviously like familiar with. That's where my practices are mostly rooted in, for the most part. And at least when we talk like for today's episode, like the topics that are on context. But I just want to know, like, man, why has this spring been so dry? It's not right. It's meant to be the hot and moist season.
So it's like I can't believe I went back to England only for this to happen.
Genuinely, yeah, it's a downright betrayal. It is, but it is what it is, and I think the nice thing is, at the end of the day, it's still cooler than it's going to be in the summer. So you gotta take the ups, can't you?
Mm,
Um, Yeah, I think, most, pretty much everyone knows the associations when it comes to spring, right? Like it's the period of generation. It's when plants are generally going to be best planted. It's when everything starts kind of growing, teeming with life. The air's temperate, hot and moist, except this year apparently. You get sun, you get rain again, except this year apparently. And animals come out of hibernation. I don't know why they'd leave the nice, cool comfort of their caves right now, but hey oh. Um, and for me, I think the most fundamental, most important moment in the spring is obviously the spring equinox. When day and night agree that they're equal, and we start moving into the rulership of the sun and the diurnal spirits over the year. And it's such a major celestial event, right? Like pretty much every culture will have some kind of acknowledgement of it to varying degrees, even if it's not a culture that has four seasons necessarily, but like the disparity in light and the transformations and changes in the way that, daytime and night are equal. And soon it's going to start being brighter throughout the entire, like the majority of the day. And that's a big deal. We talked a little bit about sect, but it also goes for spirits, right? Like, what if your court is predominantly nocturnal spirits? How are they gonna react to that kind of change? Are they gonna be a little bit, I guess the inverse of what you'd normally find in the animal world, where they do a little, not hibernate, but they might be a little bit more lax and restful during the spring, specifically because it's contrary to our own nature. I like paying attention to these kinds of things because I think it can be really informative and help us engage with spirits we might not be familiar with on a direct and personal level, but we kind of have an understanding of their characteristics, and like their environment in which they're raised. And it can give us, let's say we don't know these spirits very well, we want to approach them. We can think about when conditions in the world around us are optimal, and that includes ritual timing, right? Like I don't think we've really got time for it today. We're talking more about like grander, not grander, but like larger scale. But like planetary hours are the most obvious kind of pointer there. But like even things like the length of the days and nights, I think is still really important when it comes to that kind of thing and choosing the right time. And that might just be the election astrologer in me. I'm not saying you have to go through all of these thought processes. It's just any election astrology is going to be the same. Like we enjoy finding the most optimal time for something. And for me, that is a big part of it. Is like, okay, I'm approaching nocturnal spirits. This is going to take a very long time, and they're going to have more time to accomplish the job if it's night. Um,
Yeah.
so maybe wait till winter.
Yeah.
It's not urgent.
Totally. And I know one thing that you've mentioned a few times before in the Q&As about elections is that like, well, other astrologers can find something that they don't like about your election, and so could you with theirs, depending on your tradition, your training, what you know to emphasize more. And also, if you're an actual animist, as it were, like what you understand your spirits, like what to actually prioritize.
Yeah, yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, there is no election that is infallible. Especially when you start introducing different concepts from different places. Like, if you take a very purist approach, it'll be acceptable by one perspective, maybe, and even then, that's going to be once in a blue moon. I genuinely think it's bad manners, to be honest. Like, when it comes to that kind of thing, and that's not because I'm worried about my elections being criticized. Frankly, like, I'm more than happy to answer questions on that. This is more about something communal because. I see that. I don't think it's helpful, frankly. I think it's nice. I think it's good and polite to ask questions about why someone's taking a certain approach. I think that's the way it should really be handled. It's a lot more professional, but that's kind of veering a bit too much into outside of the context that I want to talk on too much here.
Mm,
But yeah, I mean that kind of brings us back to astrology, doesn't it? I guess. And like when it comes to the Aries ingress, which is in some ways like the election of the cosmos itself for the year, right? Um,
hmm
because it's from the Aries ingress, which is when the equinox begins, when the sun is at 0 degrees Aries, that astrologers are going to take a look at a chart and we're going to judge from that chart the entire year ahead for the nation. And that's just how powerful it is because astronomically speaking, it's the beginning of the year. And we choose that point because within the cycle of Aristotelian cosmology, it's the spring that is hot and moist. It's the spring that is generative. In the same way that, you have this cycle, right, of generation, heat, moisture, and then you go into the collar, the hot and the dry, like the summertime, and then you're moving into obviously the achronical rising for solar phases, or the autumn, and then you start getting cold and dry, and then you're cold and moist, and like you're gradually diminishing, especially for those dry periods, and especially for the cold periods, and then you kind of have this resurgence of life beginning from the spring equinox again. through the usual cycle, right? Where you're rising in the spring, peaking in the summer, declining in the autumn, and dying in winter. And as a result of that, because it happens every single year, the Aries ingress, the equinox is taken to be that starting point, the most pivotal moment, and the optimal time to make a judgment for the entire year ahead. Which unfortunately doesn't line up with our Gregorian calendar, which is a little bit inconvenient. But well, that sounds there might be a problem with me saying that.
Hold on, hold on.
I take that
I
back.
no no hold on. Insert like image of Chad mewing with his jaw, completely taut. As an Orthodox, I don't even care if it doesn't align with the proper equinoxes and solstices. The actual dates are what I say they are.
It's the feast day somewhere.
It's the feast. It's on the specific revised Julian calendar that my culture uses. The summer solstice is literally what I say it is. But I think that does raise a point about like, yes, these actual astrological events are important. Nevertheless, the folk calendar is its own thing. And I think also it would be the way I can try and explain it animistically for me has to do with relationships, as I think all of this magic is about relationships. So for example, let's say your birthday is, I don't know, March 8th or something like that. And then, but let's say all your friends can't come and hang out with you on the 8th of March because it's, let's say, a Wednesday, and then them have time off work. So they come and celebrate on the weekend. Now, this day that you celebrated is the day that you actually get to do things. Like offerings are made to you. You get your birthday presents, you go out for a dinner, you go to a party or something like that. It's not technically your birthday, but it's a day it's celebrated. And I think that's kind of how as an Orthodox have kind of like come to terms with the fact that like, oh no, we're celebrating it this day. Like May 6th is Jurjevdan for me, and that is when my summer season kicks off. It is not the solstice. But furthermore, closer to the solstice is Vidovdan, which is Vitus's day, which is incredibly important for lots of different like magical reasons. But it's still not the solstice per se. And the day that we count as the solstice can be a little bit different based on the Orthodox calendar. So, does it matter? Yes, but also when are the spirits actually being, solicited? And for me, I have just learned to enjoy all calendars and multi-track drift them and use them for my purposes. But it is really a matter of like when are the spirits expecting their due, which for me might be different from somebody who's following, let's say, the Gregorian calendar, or someone who's following extremely precise astrological timing.
I think, yeah, I love that point actually. I'm really, really happy you brought that up because actually that's something I didn't really think to include in the episode, but it's such a huge point, even from the astrological perspective, that kind of mean or averaged calendrical motion, like changes that aren't necessarily dependent on astronomy is present, even in astrology. Which can take people by surprise sometimes. But actually, if you look at the classical sources, when we talk about like the Saturn Jupiter conjunctions, which are usually used for mundane and like political judgments, they're actually not using the true conjunction. They are using a mean approximated one based on the astronomical calculation,
Hmm.
which itself today we wouldn't necessarily mean longitude is still a thing today. Yeah, it is still very much present, but it's not going to be necessarily envisioned in the same way it was in Ptolemy's day, as far as like, especially when it comes to things like calculation. So it's a bit tricky to figure out how we approach that today. But it does demonstrate like these cycles, these transformations, yes, they can be rooted in that astronomical component, but they are also, in some ways, it's not the cycle itself that's important, it's what it is a symbol of, it's what is a representation of, right? Like we talked about the sexagenary cycle. It's not exactly, like these things can quite often be when we're talking about these celestial cycles or even terrestrial ones, they are quite often symbolic in nature as much as they are anything else. Like they don't, and that's one of the fun things about calendars. I think that's exactly why that multi-track drifting can be so efficacious at times, is that it is rooted in principles that aren't necessarily solely dependent on physical phenomena in the way that we might initially expect them to be. And this is true for astrology, it's true for other calendar systems as well. Like there's a reason, for the Gregorian year, we have to have a leap year, um, because there without it, it wouldn't work. How do you
Mm,
represent a quarter of a day, right?
yeah.
And for me, I think that's one of the really fun, like that's one of the really fun things to explore. It's kind of like the zodiac, right? Like the zodiac isn't based on constellations; it's based on 30-degree divisions of the ecliptic plane, and
Mm,
that kind of, I don't want to say hypothetical, but that transient kind of almost invisible sense of time as well, is something really fascinating to me personally.
hmm Yeah, absolutely. And I really just want to make that point with the whole birthday thing because I think it just illustrates why it can matter and yet also not matter, and both dates can matter.
Yeah, yeah,
And it's also just goes into why the relationships are so important with your land, because if your family needs to just celebrate a certain day and the land also celebrates that day, or in my case it's different, right? Like the calendar that I follow is not the calendar of the country I live in right now. It's nevertheless important to understand that these spirits have certain expectations regardless, and much as your point about like the divisions of the sky based on the zodiac are not actually following the constellations as strictly. In that way as well, when we look at like farmers' almanacs and so on, they can also be more based in both literal observation of phenomena and folk wisdoms. And that actually just still makes them amazing grimoires as opposed to
Mhm.
quote unquote inaccurate or like not like perfect. It's why I think it's why I think you can talk to most astrologers and be like, well, why do you use whole signs if it's not like, and they're like, oh, shut up, shut up, shut up, you don't understand.
yeah. I mean, I think there's a bit of a Venn diagram of sorts, right? Like the same principles can be found in a lot of different places, a lot of different inspirations, or not necessarily the exact same principles, but like, the kind of notions at play here, right? Like cycles of life, flourishing, growth, nourishing, death, decay, diminishing, that kind of thing. Like these cycles can be found in a lot of different places, and that's really where a lot of different spirits. The way a spirit is going to engage in that cycle is going to differ. Certain spirits are going to patron certain components of it. Some are going to go through the entire cycle themselves. Some are eternal; they don't change. They're not going to like. And I know that's going to piss some people off. They don't like hearing that the idea of some spirits are like borderline immutable, but.
Mm,
That's okay. That's just a difference in mindsets. But that's like there's some things that I think the variance itself is something that is really one of the things that draws me to this topic in the first place. And the fun in exploring that, the beauty in exploring that, is quite invigorating for me. And returning to like the topic of the spring equinox as well, because and your point kind of it's kind of demonstrated this is like that multi-track drifting, that engagement with multiple avenues as we go along. Like I don't actually just look at the astrological chart when I'm looking at the Aries ingress. The first thing I'll do is go out and take a look at the omens, watch the clouds, watch the sky, watch what birds are moving around at the time, like what kind of action is going on in the world around me, especially within the natural world, within the natural sphere, what is exceptional, what is noteworthy, to get a better grasp on the year ahead. And this can quite often actually offer insights into the astrological chart because fundamentally they're kind of drawing on that same notion of the Aries ingress, right? Like the equinox, the equality of day and night. And so the way that the chart is depicting is hopefully going to be quite similar, if not, essentially equivalent to what I'm seeing in the natural. And I've generally found that to be the case, in that they're reinforcing one another. So that's actually something for those who are learning astrology to keep an eye on is like we're dealing with a system of practice that is dependent on time. And as a result, one of the things that you can do to improve your practice is not just think about time in the astrological sense, but extend that to the calendrical. Like look in the world around you, look in the people talk a lot about talking to their spirits directly during astrological consultations, and this is obviously always very good advice, but you can still extend that even further into omens, whether that's astronomical omens or not, but it can also include terrestrial omens, things like that. And that kind of practice is obviously quite commonplace. Like, I think Key, you even mentioned just now, right? Like the notion of looking at omens on certain days of the year.
Hmm.
And yeah, I think that's a huge method that we can be making use of. And that includes not even just like major events, but even horary charts, right? Like if you've drafted up a horary chart around a very, very similar time, if it's quite difficult, you've got to be quick. But taking out offerings into the fields and woods, notifying your spirits beforehand, that kind of thing, like, and asking them to give insight through that, and complementing the two, looking at the clouds and the wind, watching that, and watching the way that the branches sway. Like, there's so many different things you can do, and these things are fundamentally related to those cycles, to those seasons, because the tree you're looking at and the leaves that are swaying, they're going to change based on the time of the year, right? Like it's not always going to be green and flourishing. And that's going to change the implications, the meaning. How, to what degree is obviously something that takes a lot of exploration. But yeah, that's the way I found, at least. That's just like something of utility. And I really want to say thank you for bringing that up, actually, because
Of course, yeah.
yeah.
Hmm.
So you mentioned earlier on like a number of spirits, and I just wanted to ask you guys, when it comes to spring specifically, who is it that really comes to your mind like the pivotal spirit? Um, like especially in terms of your practices, like who's the most prominent when it comes to spring?
The most prominent when it comes to spring, for me, has to be George. Everything pivots around Jurjevdan. And I mentioned that Jurjevdan is really the beginning of the summer season, but it's the transition, right? It's the heat and the height of spring as it's going into now the warmer summer months. Because really, for me, the pinnacle of like summer magic has to do with that dog days of summer preceding to Ilindan, Ilya Gromovnik, Elijah the Thunder, into Blaga Maria, Mary Magdalene. But yeah, it's got to be St. George. Like so much of my spring magic, including harvesting, including washing, purifying, fertility magic, securing things, all of it's St. George based. And for those who are missing my St. George Victory Bearer charms from last year, there is a new St. George charm coming, and it's going to be paired with an excellent talisman made by Vanessa of Sword and Scythe. So keep your eyes peeled. She's making a really good one. Both of us are doing our work based on the Lance of St. George. So there's going to be a weather charm from me and a really cool talisman from her, using a powder that I made. So keep your eyes peeled on that. It's just taking us some time to put it together because we want to make it really nice. But the work was really done on his day. And I would say that he's just so pivotal for me in general. When it comes to anything with like the Serbian ritual calendar, even though we have other days as well that are really important, such as the Blandensi, for example, which is really a love day, festival, especially for young married couples, where we bake little cakes called mlencici. And it's a day of newlyweds, so it's a lot of fertility and love magic that's done around then. Jurjevdan is the ultimate for the spring season for me.
Hmm.
I love that. That's actually so I just want everyone to know like the, how pertinent that is I love that because that genuinely wasn't on my mind at all when I suggested this episode. It just lines up.
Hmm. And plus, you have all those different seasons of breaking fast, right? Because Lent is such a spring phenomenon in general. You're moving out of winter, you're entering into spring, you're fasting for long periods of time, and then there's a celebration of Easter, there's a celebration of the risen Christ, and so on. If you're following a Christian calendar, there's all these different cycles that are coming through. Also, the spring equinox itself is the new year for so many different cultures. Um, and not to mention the starting of those fires now mid-spring entering into, soon summer, like right in that middle cusp around May, and April and so on. You're really seeing the bounty of the fields, right? You're seeing the life come back to the earth and the verdant nature of this. So, like, in our cosmology, Perun is ascending back out of the ground after Velez returns into his winter slumber. And so I think that It's a celebration, especially because, for warmer weather, but the celebration of new love, of new opportunities, of new job opportunities, of new wealth, and the securing of all the hope that you want to plant in the ground so that you can harvest it after the heat of the summer has passed, then you're entering into the harvest season. So for me, so much of that is George based because George is also the spirit or the saint, I suppose, who divides up the lots of things and makes sure that the other spirits who represent winter are still paid their respects. He still divides some of the lamb that is given to him on his day, even with the wolves, led by the Master of the Wolves, who is the opposite of St. George in the sense that he rules the beginning of the winter period, which starts for us in early November.
I love the I love hearing about this. Also, like the little like dis not discrepancies, but like distinctions in time based on location, right? Like obviously the Julian calendar, but like in the UK at least, like we generally start off the spring around like mid and late February, maybe even earlier, because that's when the frost falls up
Hmm.
north, in the ground. And then it's like work, like back in the day, like during, when the UK was primarily an agricultural economy rather than a service-based one or an industrial economy. And you would just work in the fields, work, work, work until, well, basically throughout early spring up until the beginning of Shrove Tuesday, Pancake Day, as we call it today. Like,
Hey, I love Pancake Day, love a crepe day, love a Fat
mm,
Tuesday.
yes, exactly. Like, I mean, that's the real reward of spring, right? Is the pancakes.
Mm.
And then there's Easter, right? And then afterwards, once you've finished Easter, that's when things settle down. And this is when we get to the warm, leisurely period of spring. And what I really love about this is it kind of reminds me of the modalities of the zodiac, right? Because we have movable signs, we have fixed, we have common signs, and February is still, it's usually still in Pisces. It's common. It's the transition between winter and spring within astrological terms. And then, so we still have those winter labors during that time. And then even by like March, things are still busy, fast moving. A lot of things need to be done. And that's because, well, it's a movable sign, it's an active sign. There's still things that need to happen. Things are still moving from place to place. We're still seeing how the year ahead is going to look. What's the harvest yield going to be like? And then when they do finally slow down, where is the sun? He's in Taurus, right? He's in Taurus. He's in Gemini, and it's not a mistake that it's the two inferior planets. It's Venus and Mercury, who, if you give them the chance, will quite often sit down and chill. Maybe if they work, but they're not going to be out in the fields working, are they? They're going to be right, like they're going to be doing some kind of intellectual or artistic labor, avoiding
Mm.
avoiding getting their hands dirty. Not
Mm.
This is very much a generalization and a joke. I want to be clear. I'm well aware that both planets have a vested role in agriculture and industry. Um,
Mm.
you got to play on the tropes every now and then, right?
No, for sure.
And yeah, George is obviously the national saint here as well. Actually, I'm not as well informed as you. I don't think our traditions are quite as intensive. At least, definitely not today. I'll tell you that.
I will say though, if people are interested in learning a bit more about Balkan and St. George's Day festivals, I do have an article out in Viridiscini, the 2024 volume, which is literally all about this.
hmm
So if you want to hear a little bit about those particular festivals and traditions, including animal sacrifice and fertility magic and plant magic specifically, check it out because I have an article there that goes into a lot of it.
Oh yeah.
You haven't told us who your spring spirit is.
Um,
Is it a secret?
it's not really a secret. For me, it's just whoever rules my garden that year. Like when I sit down and be like, who's in charge of different parts of my house? Uh-huh.
Mm-hmm. Does it change every
Whoever.
year?
That one usually stays the same.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but for me, um, and this is kind of a biased answer as well, but like, um, one of the first things that comes to mind is Aphrodite because now everything is Aphrodite.
Yeah, no kidding.
But no, really just seeing everything waking up again in the world like is just very reminiscent of that, you know.
Mm,
And like especially the weather this time of year, like the very light rain with still the sunshine and always just like, oh yeah, that's her. You know, barring the 50 other things it could be. That essence
yeah,
is
yeah,
always
yeah.
there. Just because I guess seeing things through that lens.
Hmm.
But yeah.
Totally. And I guess since we're talking about warmer months, I think I mentioned this, but like for me, the summer is hugely patroned by Vitus, Sveti Vid, by Ilya Gromovnik, who is syncretized with Perun. This is the height of his power, right, when the earth is the warmest, and by Ognjena Maria, who is his sister, the flaming or fiery, or sometimes known as Scorched Mary in some parts, Opalena Maria, who is the yeah, just absolutely incredible saint of all the good things when it comes to dragon magic. And
Hmm.
so I would say that yeah,
Mm,
in general, when it comes to the summer and when it comes to like actually like being able to use all that energy, all that intensity, that heat, that power, the full force of the solar splendor, including all of its harsh and incredibly intense spirits. This is really all about channeling uh, that primordial heavenly thunder and fire. It's a time of great spirit combat. It's a time of tests and training. It's also a time of the cultivation of the peak of all the things that you planted and seeded um, in the springtime. So that obviously plays into my ritual calendar, but I'm always happy to hear how you guys understand that beautiful Cancer, Leo, and so on season.
for me, the the summer for me, I think it's just I know like Saint John, John's Eve is like really pivotal to the summer, and that's kind of the I'd say like at least in my context, like my practice, that's the one. Not my practice, like culturally speaking, that should probably be what comes to mind first. But sometimes personal practice comes in, patron saints come in, much as Key was talking just now in the spring rat in his garden and Aphrodite. And for me, in the case of summer, it's gonna be Christopher, and I know Key's a fellow Christopher fan as well. Um, it's just yes, he's the saint with the head of a dog who expand it like incredibly strong martial qualities. Like the pinnacle abnormal inhuman physical strength.
I'll show you Dog Days of Summer.
Exactly. Yeah,
Hmm.
Hmm.
it's too perfect, isn't it?
Hmm.
And yeah, that's exactly why is like that harshness of the heat that I kind of associate with him in my experience. Like he's a for my practice quite severe and intense, and that that's kind of why like even though culturally speaking there are more popular festivals or like events and occasions, it's still Christopher just because he's his presence is too big to ignore in that respect.
Hmm.
Hmm.
And
Yeah, yeah.
I think we should have a full episode on equinoxes and solstices. Since right now we're talking more about the general transitions between them.
yeah, oh yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, and there's so much like there's so much lore, so many different
Hmm.
beliefs. Like that'd be really fun to research as well, actually.
100%. Let's put that on the list.
Hmm.
But this was really fun. I really appreciate Salt how you took the lead on this and had us consider not just the astrological timing, but like the literal like beauty of blending in with like the weather magic and the animist kind of worldview of these spirits as you consider calendars. Because really it's a very theme and discussion, right? But like so many people are and rightly so, hooked on planetary hours. And I think that also is a form of, it's not an artificial necessarily division. It is also still a spirit acknowledged division, but it's not universal. And so when we think about these calendars, I think it's less about being um like, oh, I have to find like the true way that spirits understand time because they don't live in time in the same way. We have to think about the relationship between land, people's attitudes, like, when are you celebrating a thing? And when is the energy of the populace building around that? Actual phenomena, such as like this is quite literally the longest day of the year, or this is a day when it's really hot. Um, and also plant phenomena, earthly phenomena, and what the spiritual ecosystem of your environment actually is. And then playing it all to your maximum benefit to time your magic. It's like you said, like some things you should just wait for the winter period to do, in the way that for some rituals you want to wait until it's a waxing moon. And keeping all these things in mind help you be a better neighbor to your spirits, as well as a more cunning sorcerer in your practice.
Hmm. Reach.
Well, boys, my Akashic record is kind of a sad one, actually. It's a song that slaps, but it's not, I think it's the first sad song that I suggested for the entire playlist. It's one that if you're from the Balkans, you've heard it. It's Đurđevdanje, ja nisam son koju volim by Bijelo Dugme. This is a Serbian version of a Romani traditional folk song, Ederlezi, which is essentially a national hymn to many of the Romani peoples in the Balkans. It's dedicated to spring, to St. George. It's about your loved one not being with you on George's Day. So it's a song about powerlessness for sure. It's grief, but it's also gorgeous and so beautiful. And the lyrics involve Venus not being in the sky. It involves your loved one not being around so you don't smell the lily of the valley and so on and so forth. But like it is a beautiful song about how Georgia's Day is supposed to be this day of young couples and of love and of marriage and what happens when that is not there, right? So I picked that one because it's a beautiful folk song, but I also think it's a gorgeous reminder as well of what we hope for on these days and why we pine for these things and what we want to enchant for.
Hmm. I
Such a
love that.
beautiful pick.
Hmm.
And for me today, the Akashic record is Shu. Shoutouts to Shu, by the way.
Hmm.
Fantastic band.
Love it.
But their track Summer in the Valley.
Love it. And retreating, the license to depart is from the Heptameron because of the very obvious use of time and partition and weather.
Hmm. And even the different spirits and planets having different names and different seasons. Fantastical seasonal observance grimoire. Um,
100%.
More on that in its own episode.
Oh my God, the Heptameron episode a long time coming.
Hmm.
All right. Hit us with it like the ball lightning hit your grandpa.
Fuck.
Boom, boom, shakalaka.
Oh, fuck. All right. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost, go in peace unto your places. Peace be between us and you, and be ready to come when ye are called. If I had a nickel for every time he got struck by ball lightning, I'd have two nickels, which
That
isn't a lot, but it's weird.
that happened twice.